What is it like living with a stepfather your age? At 18, my life was anything but ordinary, shaped by the unconventional dynamics of my family. After my parents' divorce, it was just my mother, Helen, and me. She was nearly 50. Fiercely independent, and determined to rebuild her life on her own terms. Despite the challenges, we shared a close bond, though it wasn't without its fractures. My mother's relentless optimism often clashed with my more skeptical outlook, creating tension in moments when we struggled to see eye to eye. The day my mother, Helen, revealed her relationship with Ryan, my sense of normalcy shattered. My mom had always been fiercely independent, navigating life after the divorce with a determination I admired, even when we didn't always see eye to eye. But this announcement felt like something entirely different, something I couldn't understand. Ryan wasn't just younger than my mom, he was my age. The idea alone sent a wave of disbelief crashing over me. I sat in the kitchen, trying to process what my mom had just told me. The age gap was staggering, the implications unsettling. I couldn't reconcile the woman who had raised me with the person standing before me now, speaking about a relationship that seemed surreal. My thoughts raced. What would people say? How could my mom not see how strange this was? I felt a sharp pang of embarrassment, not just for my mom but for myself. When the words finally spilled out of me, they were edged with disbelief and judgment. Mom, you're almost 50. This isn't love, it's a midlife crisis. The accusation hung heavy in the air, and my mom's face hardened. Love doesn't come with rules, Sarah. My mom shot back, her voice steady but defensive. I'm happy, and I'm not asking for your permission. Happy? I snapped. How can you be happy knowing how this looks? Knowing how this makes me feel? The argument spiraled quickly, our words sharp and unforgiving. I accused her of being immature, of making a fool of herself. She accused me of being close-minded, of refusing to see her as a person separate from the role of my mother. Each retort built a wall higher between us, and by the end, the air was thick with hurt and frustration. When I finally stormed out, valid in hand, I felt a fleeting sense of vindication. But as the days passed at Emily's house, that feeling faded, replaced by a hollow unease. I replayed our argument in my mind, each exchange etched clearly in my memory. It wasn't just the age gap that bothered me. It was the shift in who my mother seemed to be, someone I no longer recognized. A week later, the wedding invitation arrived, its tone nonchalant yet final. It would be wonderful if you came. But if you don't, we'll understand. My mom's words, written in her familiar hand, carried a weight that pressed against my chest. My mom wasn't waiting for my approval. My mom was moving forward. With or without me. I sat with the invitation for hours, anger and sadness tangled in a knot I couldn't untangle. My mom was asking me to decide, could I live with this, or would I let it drive us apart for good? Despite my frustration and lingering disbelief, I found myself standing in the crowd at my mother's wedding. The ceremony was as unconventional as the relationship itself, set in a small garden filled with mismatched chairs and wildflowers. My mother glowed with a happiness I couldn't understand, her hand clasped tightly in Ryan's, her husband now, and a man my own age. I felt like an outsider, watching a performance I hadn't agreed to attend. The sight of them exchanging vows stirred something complicated in me, embarrassment mingled with resentment and a faint, grudging curiosity about what they saw in each other. The ceremony passed in a blur, each moment a reminder of how much had changed. My mother's laughter, Ryan's easy smile, the warmth of the small group who had gathered to celebrate them, it all felt foreign. When it was over, I slipped away, avoiding lingering conversations and polite smiles. A few weeks later, my tenuous escape came to an abrupt end. Living with Emily had been a temporary reprieve. But her small apartment couldn't sustain us both for long. Without a job or a clear plan, I had no choice but to return home. The thought filled me with dread. The house, once a place of stability, now felt like unfamiliar territory. Sharing it with Ryan seemed unthinkable. He wasn't just my stepfather, he was a walking reminder of everything that felt wrong about my mother's choices. Moving back in was as awkward as I had imagined. My room remained untouched, but the rest of the house bore signs of change. Ryan's belongings were scattered throughout, subtle but impossible to ignore. His shoes by the door, his books on the coffee table, his laugh echoing down the hallway, all of it grated against my nerves. It wasn't his fault, I knew that, but it didn't stop me from feeling displaced in my own home. Tension simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. My mother tried to act as though nothing had changed, but her efforts only highlighted the gulf that had opened between us. I avoided Ryan whenever I could, retreating to my room or leaving the house entirely. When we crossed paths, the silence was thick with unspoken judgments and unresolved frustrations. My mother's attempts to smooth things over only made it worse, her cheerfulness grating against the awkward reality of our situation. In those early days, every interaction felt like a test. I resented the way Ryan seemed so comfortable, as though he belonged there, while I felt like a stranger in my own home. I bristled at his attempts to include me in conversations, finding excuses to leave the room. I hated how my mother looked at him, with a softness I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly, but a sense of loss, as though her love for him had replaced something essential between us. Ryan, to his credit, never pushed. He moved through the tension with quiet patience, stepping back when I bristled and offering kindness without expectation. It annoyed me at first. His calm acceptance of my hostility. I wanted him to react, to give me a reason to justify my anger. But he didn't. Instead, he simply existed, unshaken by the storm I brought into every interaction. It was infuriating. As the days turned into weeks, the house settled into an uneasy rhythm. The tension remained, but it became less sharp, dulled by the passage of time. I still avoided Ryan. Still resented his presence, but my anger began to feel hollow, a habit rather than a conviction. I couldn't admit it, not yet, but part of me wondered if I was the one holding on to something that no longer made sense. The skepticism I carried from the wedding lingered, but it began to shift, the edges of it softening in ways I hadn't expected. Living under the same roof as Ryan forced me to see him not as an abstract symbol of everything I disliked, but as a person. And slowly, though I didn't realize it at the time, that realization began to change everything. I woke up and it turned out that the small comforts were all just my imagination. Living under the same roof as Ryan felt like stepping into a perpetual state of discomfort. Every small interaction seemed to magnify the awkwardness of our situation. Sharing a home with a stepfather my age was a concept I couldn't reconcile. And the tension only seemed to thicken with each passing day. At first, I tried to keep my distance, retreating to my room or leaving the house entirely whenever possible. But avoiding Ryan didn't erase his presence. His belongings scattered throughout the house, a jacket slung over the back of a chair, a book left open on the coffee table, were constant reminders of the shift in my reality. The house, once familiar and comforting, now felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. The tension between my mother and me only exacerbated the situation. Our arguments became increasingly volatile. The smallest disagreements escalating into shouting matches. "You've turned this house into a circus," I yelled during one particularly heated confrontation. "Do you even care how this looks? Or how it makes me feel?" Helen's face tightened, her eyes flashing with frustration. "This isn't just about you, Sarah. I have a right to be happy. When are you going to understand that?" "Happy?" I shot back. "With someone my age? It's ridiculous. You're acting like a teenager." My mom's voice rose, trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. "And you're acting like a selfish child. This isn't your decision to make. Ryan is part of my life now, whether you like it or not." Our words hung in the air, sharp and jagged, cutting into whatever remained of the bond we once shared. I stormed out of the room, my heart pounding, leaving Helen standing in the kitchen, her shoulders tense and her expression unreadable. In my frustration, I turned my anger toward Ryan. I imagined him as a meddlesome figure, quietly manipulating Helen or trying to impose himself on our fractured family. My mind conjured worst-case scenarios, each one more absurd than the last. These thoughts fed my hostility, coloring every interaction we had with suspicion and resentment. But Ryan's actions didn't align with the villain I had constructed in my mind. He didn't impose himself or try to assert authority. Instead, he navigated the tension with a quiet calm that was both infuriating and disarming. He listened when Helen and I argued. His expression neutral, never intervening unless absolutely necessary. When he did speak, it was measured, an attempt to diffuse rather than escalate. There were moments when his respectfulness was almost unbearable. As though his patience was a reflection of my own immaturity. I wanted him to react, to reveal some flaw that would justify my anger, but he didn't. Instead, he went about his days with a steady demeanor, leaving space for Helen and me to sort through our battles. The hostility I directed toward him felt increasingly one-sided. I would bristle when he entered the room, expecting some comment or action to set me off. But none came. He acknowledged me with a nod or a brief, polite remark, never lingering long enough to provoke. It was as though he understood that anything more would only add fuel to the fire. Despite his calm exterior, I couldn't bring myself to trust him. His kindness felt calculated, a strategy to win Helen over and pacify me. I scrutinized his every move, searching for cracks in his demeanor, for evidence that my suspicions were warranted. But the more I watched, the more I realized there was little to find. He was respectful, even considerate, in ways that were difficult to hate. He encouraged Helen to be patient with me, to listen rather than dismiss my frustrations. On rare occasions, I overheard him speaking to my mom in hushed tones, his words carrying a sincerity that made me pause. Yet, even as his actions began to chip away at my assumptions, the tension in the house remained. Helen and I couldn't seem to bridge the gap between us, our arguments leaving a trail of unresolved emotions that lingered long after the shouting stopped. Ryan's presence, while steady, felt like an unspoken challenge, a reminder of the changes I had yet to accept. As weeks turned into months, the weight of the tension began to shift. I couldn't pinpoint when it happened, but somewhere along the way, my hostility lost its edge. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the realization that Ryan wasn't the enemy I had made him out to be. He was simply a man who loved my mother, who wanted to find his place in a family that wasn't his by blood. And in his quiet way, he was doing what he could to make it work. The house didn't feel like home yet. But it no longer felt entirely foreign. Ryan's calm presence had a way of softening the edges of the conflicts that had defined those early days. And while I wasn't ready to embrace him as family, I could no longer deny that he was trying, not to replace anyone, but to build something new alongside us. The tension in our household didn't dissipate overnight, but Ryan's quiet persistence in navigating the conflicts between my mother and me became impossible to ignore. He had a way of stepping into the fray without escalating it, his calm demeanor acting as a buffer in our emotionally charged arguments. Where I expected him to side with Helen, he surprised me by taking a more measured approach, one that began to shift my perspective on him. One evening, after yet another heated argument with my mother, I retreated to my room, slamming the door behind me. My frustration burned, fueled by Helen's refusal to understand my feelings. Moments later, there was a soft knock at my door. "It's Ryan," he said. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, then opened the door reluctantly. "What?" I snapped, fully expecting a lecture. But Ryan didn't respond in kind. He leaned against the doorframe, his expression calm. "I'm not here to take sides," he said. "I just want to understand what's bothering you." His response caught me off guard. For the first time, someone seemed genuinely interested in hearing me out without dismissing my frustrations. I began venting, releasing all the pent-up anger I felt toward Helen's decisions, my discomfort with Ryan's presence, and my sense of displacement in my own home. Ryan listened intently, his steady gaze encouraging me to continue even when my voice faltered. Later that night, I overheard Ryan speaking to Helen in the kitchen. His calm, firm tone carried through the walls as he explained my perspective. He pointed out that my anger wasn't baseless but stemmed from feeling pushed aside in my mom's life. His words were measured, emphasizing the importance of meeting me halfway. Though I couldn't hear Helen's full response, my mom's softened tone was unmistakable. It was the first time I'd heard my mom speak about me with something other than exasperation. The realization that Ryan was advocating for me, not against me, stirred an unexpected sense of gratitude. Over time, his influence became undeniable. He acted as a mediator, steering our conversations away from conflict and toward understanding. He encouraged Helen to ask questions instead of making assumptions, and when I grew frustrated, he reminded me to be patient. His insights, though frustratingly reasonable, began to make sense. And slowly my walls started to crack. Ryan's actions challenged the assumptions I'd held about him. One afternoon, I found him fixing a wobbly chair in the living room. I sat nearby, watching him work, and for the first time, felt compelled to ask why he bothered. His quiet reply lingered with me long after. He genuinely believed our family was worth the effort. As the weeks turned into months, the tension in our home began to ease. Helen and I still clashed, but the fights lost their sharp edges, softened by Ryan's quiet influence. He created space for both of us to feel heard. And though the process was slow, it felt authentic. I found myself opening up more, not just to Ryan but to Helen as well, and the moments of connection began to outweigh the conflicts. Ryan's presence hadn't solved everything, but it changed how we approached our problems. He taught me that understanding doesn't require agreement and that patience can be more powerful than anger. For the first time, I began to see him not as an outsider but as someone who truly belonged. Music had always been a part of me, a refuge and a passion that felt as natural as breathing. But in our household, it was a forbidden subject. My mother, Helen, had long associated music with my father, her ex-husband. For my mom, the sound of a piano or the sight of sheet music stirred memories of a painful past my mom wanted to forget. As a result, my mom had banned me from pursuing it, her decision unwavering despite my pleas. The tension around this unspoken rule had simmered for years, but it reignited one evening when Ryan stumbled upon my old keyboard tucked away in the closet. He placed it in the living room, a casual gesture that felt like a challenge to the fragile peace in our home. When Helen saw it, my mom's face darkened. "Why is this here?" my mom demanded, her voice sharp. "I thought Sarah might want to play again," Ryan said, his tone calm but firm. Helen turned to me, her eyes narrowing. "We've talked about this. Music isn't something we need in this house." My frustration boiled over. "It's not about you, Mom. It's about me. Music is what I love. Why can't you just let me have that?" The argument spiraled from there, our voices rising until Ryan stepped between us. "This isn't solving anything," he said, his voice steady. "Helen, you're punishing Sarah for something that's not her fault. Music isn't the problem here." Helen's silence was heavy as my mom left the room, her jaw tightening with unspoken tension. For a fleeting moment, I felt a flicker of triumph, but it quickly dissolved into guilt. I hadn't intended to make things worse, yet that seemed to be the inevitable outcome of every confrontation. In the days that followed, Ryan quietly continued to advocate for me. I often overheard snippets of his calm, persistent conversations with Helen. He urged my mom to separate my love for music from my mom's painful memories of the past, framing it not as a reminder of loss but as a way for me to build my own future. Gradually, Helen's resistance began to soften. The change wasn't immediate, but small signs emerged. My mom's tense posture relaxed slightly when she passed by the keyboard, and my mom's silence turned to quiet observation as I practiced. One afternoon, my mom even lingered in the room while I played, her presence cautious but no longer antagonistic. Ryan's support extended beyond the conversations. He found a local music class and encouraged me to join, giving me the nudge I needed to take that first step. With his reassurance, I decided to give it a try. Attending the class felt like stepping into a new world, a room filled with instruments, melodies, and peers who shared my passion. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of freedom and belonging that had been missing from my life. As I immersed myself in music, Helen's support became more tangible. My mom started asking questions about my classes, her curiosity genuine rather than begrudging. When I performed at a small recital, I noticed my mom sitting in the audience beside Ryan. My mom's presence, though understated, filled me with an unexpected warmth. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it was enough to show that my mom was trying. Music became more than a personal passion, it transformed into a bridge between us. Helen's initial resistance gave way to an understanding of how much it meant to me, and I, in turn, began to see my mom's struggles with greater empathy. Ryan's role in this transformation was pivotal. His quiet persistence and unwavering support helped Helen and me find common ground where none had seemed possible before. In the end, music wasn't just about the notes or melodies. It became a way for me to rediscover my voice and share it, even in a household where it had once been silenced. For that, I would always be grateful to Ryan for believing in me, and to Helen for letting go of the past to embrace the present. However, it seems that's not all I expected. From the bottom of my heart, I wanted us to be able to meet outside, in front of everyone. The graduation music showcase was an event I had poured my heart into, yet as the day approached, I felt a pang of dread. While performing on stage was exhilarating, I couldn't shake the thought that my mother, Helen, and Ryan wouldn't be there to see it. Given our history, their disapproval of my musical pursuits still lingered in my mind. Helen had softened over time, but I doubted that my mom or Ryan would go out of their way to attend. The auditorium buzzed with energy that evening, filled with proud families and excited graduates. As I stood backstage, clutching my sheet music, I tried to focus on the performance ahead. The lights dimmed, and I took a deep breath before stepping onto the stage. The applause was polite but distant, and I resolved to do my best regardless of who was watching. As I positioned myself at the piano, my eyes instinctively scanned the audience. My heart skipped a beat when I saw them, Helen and Ryan, sitting in the front row. Helen's usually reserved demeanor had given way to an encouraging smile, and Ryan's enthusiastic wave left no doubt that they were there for me. My hands trembled slightly on the keys. Not from nerves but from the overwhelming wave of emotion their presence brought. The performance felt like a blur, every note carrying more meaning than I had anticipated. Seeing them there, cheering me on, filled me with a renewed sense of purpose. When I hit the final chord, the applause was thunderous, but it was Helen and Ryan's standing ovation that brought tears to my eyes. For a moment, the tension and conflicts of the past seemed to dissolve, replaced by a warmth I hadn't felt in years. After the performance, I hesitated in the hallway, unsure if I should approach them. But they found me first. Helen pulled me into a tight hug, her voice unsteady as she said, "You were incredible." Ryan's usual calm was replaced with an energy that mirrored my own excitement. "We're so proud of you," he said, his sincerity unmistakable. That night marked a turning point in our relationship. It wasn't just about the music, it was about acceptance and reconciliation. Their presence at the showcase symbolized more than support for my passion, it was a gesture of love, a willingness to move beyond the past and embrace the person I was becoming. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were truly a family, united not by perfection but by the effort to understand and support one another. As I lay in bed that night, replaying the evening in my mind, I realized how much their presence had meant to me. It wasn't the applause or the accolades that made the night memorable, it was the knowledge that they believed in me. Helen and Ryan had shown up, not just for the performance, but for me, and that made all the difference. Looking back, it's almost hard to reconcile my initial feelings about Ryan with the men I eventually came to respect. When he first entered our lives, I saw him as an interloper, someone who had disrupted the already fragile balance in our family. To me, he represented everything I couldn't accept about my mother's choices and everything I feared about change. I resisted him from the start. Every interaction felt like a battle, whether spoken or silent, to assert my disdain. I wanted him to react, to prove my suspicions that he didn't belong. But Ryan's calm demeanor refused to yield. Instead of retaliating against my hostility, he approached it with patience, a quiet persistence that began to chip away at my walls. Over time, it became clear that Ryan wasn't trying to replace anyone or impose himself where he wasn't wanted. His presence wasn't about control or dominance, it was about understanding. Slowly, I began to see him for who he truly was, a man who genuinely cared for my mother and, by extension, for me. Ryan's maturity became a cornerstone in our household. Where I had expected conflict, he brought resolution. He had a way of stepping into tense moments and diffusing them with quiet insight, helping my mother and me see each other's perspectives without demanding immediate agreement. His influence softened the sharp edges of our arguments, creating space for conversations that had once seemed impossible. His support extended beyond our conflicts. He saw me not as a stubborn teenager clinging to old wounds but as someone trying to find her place in a shifting world. He encouraged my passions, advocated for my independence, and reminded me of my worth when I doubted it most. In doing so, he bridged the gap between my mother and me, helping us rebuild the connection we had lost. One of the most poignant ways Ryan impacted our family was through his unwavering belief in the importance of listening. He didn't just hear us, he understood us. When my mother struggled to let go of her past, he gently reminded her that moving forward didn't mean forgetting. When I resisted her attempts to reconnect, he encouraged her to approach me with patience rather than frustration. His guidance transformed our interactions, turning them from battles into efforts to understand one another. Ryan's actions spoke louder than words. He didn't demand respect, he earned it through consistency and care. Whether it was fixing a broken chair, helping me prepare for a music recital, or simply being present during moments of tension, he showed that he was committed to our family in ways that went beyond obligation. Slowly, I found myself letting go of the assumptions I had made about him, replacing them with a growing respect for his character. As the months turned into years, the fractures in our family began to heal. My mother and I, once caught in a cycle of conflict and misunderstanding, started to rebuild our bond. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, it was a series of small, meaningful moments that accumulated over time. A shared laugh during dinner. A quiet conversation about the past. A mutual pride in each other's growth. Ryan's influence was woven into all of it, subtle but undeniable. Looking back, I realized that Ryan didn't just help repair our family, he helped redefine it. He taught me that family isn't about perfection or blood ties, it's about showing up, day after day, with love and commitment. His presence reminded me that change, while uncomfortable, can lead to something stronger and more meaningful than what came before. In the end, my respect for Ryan wasn't about his role as my stepfather. It was about who he was as a person. He showed me the power of patience, the importance of understanding, and the value of building bridges instead of walls. Through his example, I learned that relationships, even the most strained, can grow and thrive when nurtured with care. And for that, I will always be grateful.